Hey everybody, welcome to the third main video of Request Month 2024. It was originally intended to be a full review of Serious Sam 4, but after having played the game for several hours, I just can't force myself to finish it, so you're getting this instead. I'm not exactly sure what the title of the video is going to be as I'm recording this, but obviously by the time the video goes live, you'll know what the title is there, and, well, it'll be in the same general category as all the games that infuriate me to no end videos and stuff like that. And for those of you who know my history with the Serious Sam series, you'll probably be pretty surprised by this. I mean, I pretty thoroughly enjoyed First and Second Encounter for what they were, and even though Serious Sam 2 has plenty of issues, it still has a fair bit of charm as well, so it's not irredeemable or anything. But then you get to Serious Sam 3, and that's where the series really started to lose its way. They started taking it way too seriously, and it felt like they were trying to shove in a bunch of modern military FPS stuff that really didn't belong there at all. So where does 4 stand in this whole series? Well, the game released in 2020, which means that as of September of this year, it will have been 4 years since the game launched, and it still feels incredibly unfinished. The game launched with a bunch of severe technical problems, and while they patched up a bunch of those over the years, they still haven't gotten all of them. I mean, the trees and such still flicker constantly, which looks bizarre, and I'm not sure what the hell would cause it. And of course, there's still a huge amount of model and texture pop-in that is very noticeable even when you're running the game on an SSD like I am. Even once you look past technical problems like those, you also have things like the characters just looking awful, particularly in regards to facial animations and the eyes. The eyes just have this constant, glassy, dead-eyed stare, and it just looks terrible. And it makes it pretty abundantly clear why so many of the characters wear sunglasses. It's to hide the eyes because they knew how bad they looked. And then the facial animations look like they came out of a game from about 20 years ago at this point, which is baffling because Serious Sam 3 didn't really have that problem so much. I mean, the facial animations weren't great in that game, but they certainly looked better than this. But as rough as those are, the rest of the graphics really aren't much better. They definitely look dated. They look like a game that could have come out several years ago at this point, even more than is usual for stuff made by Crow Team. And a fair bit of that is likely due to the amount of asset reuse, particularly from the Talos principle. And while I'm not necessarily opposed to asset reuse in and of itself, the way Crow Team did it makes it really feel like they just quickly and cheaply threw the game together with whatever assets they had laying around. Even the new assets made specifically for Serious Sam 4 look like they could have been taken from a game from many years ago at this point, and it just doesn't look good. To make matters worse, they have still stuck with the semi-realistic art style that they introduced to the series with Serious Sam 3, only they've added considerably more color than that game did. That game was basically nothing but brown and gray, and it was incredibly annoying. This one at least has a fair bit more color in it, but it still has problems like the particle and dust effects constantly kicking up and obscuring what you're doing, the environmental lighting being pretty much completely static, and certain enemy types being a bit difficult to distinguish at a distance, especially once they start getting lost in the huge hordes that the game starts to throw at you. But while those issues have a noticeable effect on the gameplay, there's another more subtle issue that the game has that actually affected the experience of Serious Sam 4 more in the long run than those things that were really annoying in individual moments. Remember how I said this game feels like it was just thrown together with whatever assets Crow Team had? That is especially true with the way the levels are put together. It's not just the environmental art and assets. It's the way the levels themselves are put together. Now, you may not necessarily know this unless you've played previous Serious Sam games enough to really get it, but while the common perception of level design in Serious Sam games is corridors connecting large open arenas, that's only a superficially true statement. In the First and Second Encounter as well as Serious Sam 2, there was a surprising amount of variation in the way those combat arenas were set up. It would provide different types of challenges as you progressed. And especially once you got into Second Encounter and Serious Sam 2, they would throw in even more environmental variation. You would have traps that you would need to contend with, you would have environmental puzzles on occasion, and then once you got to Serious Sam 2 in particular, they threw in a lot more variation with the way the combat arenas were designed, with how they threw in vehicle sections, and even introduced things like timed combat arenas where you had to push forward through the hordes at a rapid pace. And you would start encountering these variances pretty early on in the game. Serious Sam 4, on the other hand, does not have this. In fact, I would argue that Serious Sam 4 doesn't even really have level design at all. It just has large open combat arenas for you to shoot stuff in, and occasionally some corridors that connect them, and they'll throw some enemies at you in some of those corridors as well. This series has always had a bit of a problem with the combat feeling kind of repetitive after a while, but in Serious Sam 4 that happens almost immediately, because whereas in previous games they threw in a lot more devious traps at you, as well as carefully designed arenas with associated combat encounters, with Serious Sam 4 it's more like the Crow team just threw up their hands, said screw it, just throw hundreds of enemies at them, that'll be challenging enough, right? And while this series has always had the undercurrent of, okay, you're going to be dealing with a lot of enemies all at once, this is the first time in the series where that's all you get. Even Serious Sam 3, as rough as that game's edges were, still had actual level design with combat encounters designed around those levels. Now, the quality of those levels and the combat encounters is far more debatable, but at least it still had them. Serious Sam 4 doesn't even really have them. So instead of getting the gradual repetitiveness like you did with the previous games and maybe needing to take breaks every so often, you get it almost immediately with Serious Sam 4, and it never goes away. It's the kind of thing that goes well beyond excuses that you might have for something like the technical problems or the general unpolished nature of the game. Those are more likely due to outside influences, but this is more of a fundamental game design problem. The kind of thing that if they were doing proper playtesting, they should have caught very early on and done something about. The fact that they didn't tells me one of three things. Either A, they're somehow incapable of recognizing this problem, which I have a very hard time believing considering their previous games didn't really suffer from this problem anywhere near as much, or they just don't care and wanted to get the game out as quickly as possible just to make a quick buck off of it. I also have a bit of a hard time believing that idea, which leads me to the third option, which is they decided from a very early point in the game's development that they were going to go all in on pure scale and nothing else. And when you look at the game's marketing and how they emphasize the sheer number of enemies on screen at once, I'm pretty sure we have a winner there. So if you're just going to overwhelm the player with the sheer number of enemies on screen, what do you really need to do with that? Do you actually need to design levels? Well, no, you just need very big open combat arenas to house all of these enemies coming at you all at once. So I have a feeling that what they actually did with this whole thing is because they had Talos Principle 2 in development at the same time, they probably threw all of their proper level design efforts into Talos Principle 2 because a puzzle game like that actually needs level design to function, and so they just had whoever was left work on throwing together some combat arenas to throw a whole bunch of enemies at the player at in Serious Sam 4 and called it a day. And I also have a feeling that's where they threw all of their writers as well, because the writing in Serious Sam 4 is horrible. This series has never had particularly good writing, don't get me wrong, but the story in Serious Sam 4 is basically just filler content. It's meant to be a prequel to Serious Sam 3 BFE, which itself was basically nothing but filler content anyway because it was a prequel to Serious Sam First Encounter. And none of these games had much going on in terms of story to begin with. The characters are entirely one-note, completely uninteresting, and not even remotely funny. The only one who's even slightly funny is Sam himself, and that's because he's more or less intact from the previous games in the series. The supporting cast, on the other hand, well, they're just insufferable. When they're not spouting absolutely cringe-inducing one-liners, they're just throwing around idiotic drivel that is completely uninteresting at best, and groan-inducing at worst. On the positive side, you can skip all the cutscenes and thus avoid the completely inane plot and crappy dialogue for the most part, but then you still get the dialogue during the actual levels themselves, and if you want to get rid of that, you have to turn the voice volume off, which gets rid of all of the voices. Their portraits still pop up when they're speaking, but there's no audio. Oh, and Sam doesn't give any one-liners either, so it's really awkward if you do that. Still, the supporting cast are annoying enough that it actually ends up being kinda worth it anyway. Now, of course, if you can get past the writing, you might be able to get something out of the gameplay, but there you're going to run into the problems with the level design, and that's going to mesh with the gunplay and the way the enemies work. Now, the gunplay is arguably the best part of this game. It's more or less a continuation of what we saw with Serious Sam 3, although they did make a few tweaks. For example, the shotgun no longer has a reload required. It just keeps shooting like you could with the previous Serious Sam games. There are also weapon upgrades that you can either just find in the levels, or you earn them through completing side objectives, or you just find them as part of the main storyline anyway, and they just get automatically applied. And those can be things like adding an underslung grenade launcher to the shotgun, or making your rocket launcher a multi-rocket launcher that can lock onto things and then launch the rockets at them. And while some of these upgrades work better than others, they're generally a pretty welcome addition. As for the weapons themselves, well, if you've played Serious Sam 3, you're going to be familiar with almost the entirety of the arsenal, except for the new auto shotgun, which is, well, it's just an auto shotgun. Not exactly an earth-shattering revelation of a weapon or anything. They generally feel alright to use, although some of the enemies can be very bullet spongy, at least if you're not shooting them directly in their weak spot, which will give you an indicator on the crosshair showing that you hit them in the weak spot. And of course, you'll also notice that their health bar goes down quite a bit more than if you were just to shoot them somewhere else. That's another thing that is noteworthy about the way this combat system works. There are health bars on all the enemies when you're shooting at them, so that you have a better idea of how many hits it takes to bring one down. Now, the problem with the arsenal is that while there are some pretty cool weapons in there, you're not really given enough ammunition to make good use of them until much later on in the game, so you end up using primarily the shotgun, the double-barreled shotgun, and the pistol. This makes the combat fairly tedious until you do finally get to the point where the game starts giving you more ammunition for the other weapons. But by the time the game does start giving you more ammo for the other weapons, any kind of enjoyment you get out of the arsenal is completely offset by the fact that every single combat encounter just devolves into a chaotic mess where the main thing you're doing is moving backwards and strafing left and right as you move backwards while you shoot at a horde that is just charging at you. Now sure, that did become a problem in the previous Serious Sam games as well, but at least with the more curated combat encounters and the actual level design that those had, you really didn't feel like that was all you were doing. That's not the case with Serious Sam 4. Serious Sam 4 feels like that's all you're doing. And the gameplay loop becomes extremely repetitive extremely quickly as a result. It's actually kind of funny when you think about the phrase that keeps getting uttered with this game, where its game design hasn't really evolved since the first encounter released over 20 years ago. That's simply not true, because the series did evolve, at least between first and second encounter, and of course Serious Sam 2. And sure, that didn't always work, and Serious Sam 2 in particular went completely off the rails, but at least they were trying different things. They were trying to evolve the formula. Then Serious Sam 3 came along and introduced some rather unwanted modern military shooter ideas into the mix, and that just didn't work out very well. And finally you get to Serious Sam 4, where it seems like they've just given up. The closest thing they've done in this game to try to expand the mechanics further is introduce an extremely unwelcome upgrade system, where occasionally scattered in the levels you'll find crates that have purple orbs in them, and Sam will pick those up and shatter them, and breathe in the mist that they create, which will then give him a perk point that he can spend to get various abilities like being able to dual-wield certain weapon types, and you can gradually expand the types of weapons you can dual-wield, or things that just give him passive bonuses like being able to reload faster, or being able to restore some health upon getting the melee finisher kills. It only gives you 2 hit points, and you don't get any kind of invincibility frames or anything like that when you're going through those animations, so they're a complete liability. You will actually take more damage when trying to go through those canned animations than what the animations heal. As a result, they are utterly worthless, and no one in their right mind would ever use them, so effectively you end up wasting perk points on that. But of course, because it's a perk tree, that's one of the things you have to get in order to get to other stuff that you might actually want to use. It's the kind of thing you look at and you just wonder what the hell they were thinking, and the entire skill tree system itself is completely unwelcome in a Serious Sam game. I mean, it's an entirely linear, single-player first-person shooter, where each level of the campaign is likely to have only one side objective. Why is there a skill system? Just give the player these perks and items and such as they're playing. If you want to have them dual wielding, well, have them pick up another weapon of the same type, and well, now you can switch to having both of them out at the same time. And hell, speaking of dual wielding, when you go to dual wield, if you're using weapons that have a secondary fire, you can no longer use the secondary fire, so in some cases, that actually makes the weapons even worse. The whole thing comes across like they just implemented these ideas without doing really any playtesting of them beforehand and just said, it'll be fine. we got a whole bunch of enemies on screen. That makes up for any other issues we've got, right? Well, no, Crow Team, it doesn't make up for the other issues. What you've got here is a game that ends up being a jumbled mess that doesn't seem to know what it actually wants to be, and more importantly, it's really, really friggin' boring. I mean, since there's basically no actual level design, you'll be wandering around looking for secrets and find just some random item sitting out in the open, and that counts as a secret for some baffling reason. And then some other time you'll be wandering around looking for secrets and find out that you've accidentally wandered off into the blank space outside of the level and have to find your way back in. And the secrets themselves end up being not remotely worth it anyway. You don't get actual meaningful rewards for them like you did in the previous Serious Sam games. You might get a bit of extra ammo, health, and armor, but that's kind of it. And if you go to complete side objectives, more often than not you'll find yourself backtracking through very large sections of the level doing absolutely nothing but running from one point to the other. Because there was basically no care put into the level design, there's really no flow to them at all. It's just combat arena after combat arena, and it very quickly becomes extremely repetitive. And the combat loop itself becomes boring extremely quickly when you realize that they threw everything into the quantity of enemies on screen and not the actual quality of the encounters on top of the quantity of enemies on screen. Because that was the thing about the older Serious Sam games. It wasn't just about the number of enemies on screen. That was a big deal at the time because 3D engines weren't really capable of rendering that many enemies on screen, and so it was really cool that the Serious Sam series was able to do that. But your engine being able to render a large number of enemies on screen is merely a tool. When used correctly in conjunction with, at the very least, decent level design, it can be really interesting and exhilarating. The first and second encounters both proved that, and to some degree in Serious Sam 2 as well. It just went kinda off the deep end in a lot of ways. But it's pretty easy to tell that the series really started to lose its way with Serious Sam 3, and by the time you get to Serious Sam 4, you can't help but wonder if Crow Team even cares about the series anymore. I mean, after all, in a post-Talos Principle world, Crow Team are clearly purveyors of fine art now. Something like Serious Sam is beneath them. Obviously, I'm being kind of sarcastic here, but you can't help but wonder if that's a mentality that has taken root at the studio, given how little effort seems to have actually gone into Serious Sam 4 versus how much went into the Talos Principle 2. I mean, if I'm being really charitable here, Serious Sam 4 feels like, at absolute best, a tech demo for the Legion system, which is a feature they've implemented into the Serious engine that allows them to showcase thousands of characters on screen at once. And yet, they didn't even really do anything with that because it's only used at the very beginning of the game and the very end of the game. And if they're only really showcasing this new tech in the engine twice in the entire game, it doesn't really make it a very good tech demo, does it? But whatever the reality behind its original intent, Serious Sam 4 just comes across as not only a blatantly unfinished game, but one that the developers just didn't really seem to give much of a crap about. And while it's certainly a playable game, and you can see occasional glimpses of where the gunplay in particular might be kind of fun, it's just so poorly assembled that I cannot recommend it to anybody except the most absolute die-hard Serious Sam fans, and let's face it, they've already picked the game up and played through it anyway. If you're looking to get into the series, then just pick up First and Second Encounter. They may not necessarily be your cup of tea, but at least those are still quite good. The rest of the series is a lot more of a mixed bag. But Serious Sam 4 is the first game in the series that is so bland, boring, and ultimately just crappily thrown together that I don't feel like it's even worth finishing for a review, and thus highly recommend that you just avoid it entirely. Now, I have read that Siberian Mayhem, the standalone expansion, is actually considerably better than Serious Sam 4, so I do have a copy of that already, and I will take a look at it eventually. But after how severely disappointing Serious Sam 4 was, let's just say I'm not exactly looking forward to it. We'll see how it goes, though. In the meantime, it's been a really long day, and I'm getting tired, so I'm going to go ahead and get some rest, and then get back to working on the last part of Request Month content. And then from there, it's making the Q&A video. So if you have questions for the Q&A video, make sure you get those submitted. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my channel, please consider supporting it on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine. I understand, but the option's there if you're interested, and every bit does help. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.